All right, so today we are talking about the implementation and evaluation of the IMC plan. How do we go about, once we've developed the IMC plan, putting it into practice, and then how do we evaluate whether or not we're achieving the goals that we set out for in the IMC plan? And I'm going to test the audio here. I forgot to do that to make sure that it is working. Looks like it's working. All right. I think it's working. Yeah, it is. All right. So there are a number of appeals and execution styles that we can use. The two biggest ones are the informational or rational appeal and the emotional appeal. And these are largely dependent upon whether or not the product is something that is utilitarian in nature or something that is less than utilitarian. Although there are exceptions, obviously, for example, with regard to emotional appeals, things like security systems are utilitarian in nature, and you use an emotional appeal to sell those. Or use a mixed appeal in many instances where you combine aspects of the rational appeal with an emotional setting. So the information or rational appeal focuses on the practical aspects of a product or service, its functions, or its utilitarian provisions, things that make it useful to the consumer. So practical are things like the ease of use. Functions are the various features that the product or service offers and how they work to perform some task. And then utilitarian, the cost benefit analysis of the product or service to the consumer. We're really short on students today. We have one in class, and I don't see anybody online. Emotional appeals focus on things like safety, security. They use fear, love, affection, happiness, joy, nostalgia, sentiment, or excitement. Issues of fear pervade modern society, and this is one of the things that we talk about when we talk about ethics, for example, in IMC. Should you use fear as a motivator? And so I have an ad that we'll watch to demonstrate this and how you can use fear. Let me turn the volume up. So what do you think of that ad?
Fear-mongering and politics seem to go hand in hand when it comes election time.
Right.
So it's pretty commonplace, I think, in that aspect. But I don't really see like fear in ads like that aren't political most of the time.
What about this one? Have we watched the CTCA Peggy ad?
I don't think so.
I think they have actually taken this off. But I think you can still get it on YouTube. So there's one that uses fear, right? I mean, you use the word cancer and it creates a lot of fear in most people's mind. It turns out Peggy died of pancreatic cancer, and I don't say that flippantly. That's just a reality, is that almost nobody survives pancreatic cancer. There are two types of pancreatic cancer. One is very fast acting and you die very quickly. Unfortunately, I've lost two colleagues to that, both retired, and within a year they had both developed pancreatic cancer and passed away very, very quickly. The second type can go into remission, but you're probably going to die from it. So Peggy actually died. I don't think CTCA is actually in business anymore. And I used to say, if I was going to go, and let me give you a duck here. I used to say, if I'm gonna, have to choose where I'm gonna go for cancer treatment, it's probably not CTCA. I'd probably go to the Mayo Clinic, and the Mayo Clinic doesn't advertise. They do advertise now. After I started saying that, they've started advertising. But I still think that I would probably go to the Mayo Clinic over CTCA, and I'm not even sure that CTCA is even in business anymore. What that ad does that's effective, in my opinion, as opposed to the Bush ad creates a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of apprehension, particularly when that ad was playing after the attacks on September 11th, when we had an enormous amount of anxiety in this country over incidences of international terrorism, right? And those incidences coming to the United States shores. It doesn't provide hope. What the CTCA ad does is it talks about something that's really scary, cancer, and in particular pancreatic cancer, but it also provides hope, right? I mean, it's come to CTCA, look at our success rates, look at what we do. The decisions are always, about you. So I think that one is a much more effective ad. The Bush ad says, look, John Kerry and the liberals, it leaves it to your imagination to pick up and fill in the blank, which is that George W. Bush is not going to do that. You can also use humor, and humor ads have been shown. I mean, people remember them, but they're less effective. So Let me show you one that's a political ad, and I think it's much less effective. Um, so that was one of Bush's ads. That one's a funny ad. Um, Statistics kind of show that with regard to political advertising, humor doesn't work. People don't. I mean, they think it's a funny ad. I mean, people responded favorably to the ad. They said they liked the ad, but does it actually motivate people to vote? I don't know. I mean, Bush did win that election, but can you say it was because of that ad? I think probably more than anything, it was just because we were in the middle of a war, and people have a tendency to not switch horses in midstream in the middle of a war. I'm not sure that the ad was terribly effective. Fear, so love, affection, happiness are also things that we can use in terms of an emotional appeal. Excitement, again, which of these you choose largely depends on what kind of product you're selling. So if you're selling security systems, ADT, for example, you're going to focus on safety and security and those kinds of emotional appeals. If you're selling Walt Disney World, and Disney's coming up on one of their big anniversaries for I think it's their 50th year at Walt Disney World or something like that. You're going to have excitement, right? Experience the magic and happiness and joy. One of the things that I think is important to recognize, like almost everything in the class, when we talk about these topics, we talk about them as though they are silos, and we think of these as being, a module as a unit of knowledge that is sort of self-contained in and of itself, that focuses on similarly situated ideas or concepts within the greater construct of integrated marketing communication. And you have to remember that there's a lot of overlap. So for example, if you were focusing on fear, you also probably are going to focus on safety and security, right? Use the fear to motivate and then provide hope, which is, providing a solution to the safety and security needs that people feel. If you're focusing on excitement, for example, for Disney, you're probably also going to have a lot of joy. Disney's overall theme of their theme parks, Walt Disney World, Disneyland, it starts with Main Street USA, which is a nostalgic appeal to go back in time to something that was simpler and a kinder, sort of gentler world. So although we think of these appeals as being distinct, you'll find that there's a lot of overlap between them, just like there's a lot of overlap between the units that we study in this course, and how they all sort of integrate together. And that's one of the things that I think marketing does a good job of, is that we do focus on the integration of sort of knowledge and using that knowledge across the other disciplines or aspects of business, the substantive disciplines of business. So combining rational and emotional appeals. Consumers often use a combination of emotion and rational thinking. I asked in this class at the beginning, I think when we were talking about ethics, can you pursue an irrational goal from a rational perspective? And the answer is Yes, you can. You can pursue a completely irrational goal. Does anybody need a Rolex, right? The Rolex presidential model, that's the day date model in either, solid 18 karat gold or platinum, starts at about $54,000. That's an astronomical amount of money to pay for a watch, right? Does anybody need that watch? No. But if you want the watch, you can go about pursuing it, in a rational way, make a lot of money, have a good job, and then, figure out how you're going to, go buy the watch, where you're gonna locate it. In Oklahoma, there's very few Rolex dealers. In the Oklahoma City metro area, there's one, it's BC Clark. So you're gonna have to, figure out how you get there and buy the watch. It's a completely irrational goal, but you can pursue it in a rational manner. We oftentimes use fear to motivate people and then provide them with a solution to that fear. Again, if we think about selling ADT for safety, it's about, everybody has some fear of, for example, a home fire or a break-in, and ADT provides solutions for that kind of thing. One of the things that some ethicists say is that you cannot make, that you cannot have autonomous decisions if you're emotional. And I'm not sure that that's true. And some ethicists also argue, some philosophers argue, that autonomy is not something that you have one moment and not the next, or that you have a lack of autonomy one moment and then you all of a sudden have autonomy in the next. And again, I'm not sure that that's true. For example, with regard to CTCA's ad, if somebody's told that they have pancreatic cancer, you may not have a great deal of autonomy over that decision when you see the CTCA ad. And the critical question is the will overborne? At that moment. But I think you can make good decisions in other aspects of your life. So for example, if you are a business owner, although you may be concerned about your diagnosis of cancer, I think in another context, you can be a rational human being. So the question with regard to acting completely irrationally is the will overborne? Is the appeal such that it overbears the ability to think critically in that moment? So is the will overborne? Are you so emotional at the time you see the ad when you get the diagnosis for pancreatic cancer or, colon cancer or lung, cancer of the lungs or things like that, that you're not really making informed decisions about your healthcare, and you're being swayed by the ad like Peggy? I mean, it's an enormously emotionally powerful ad, the Peggy ad. So the first ad that they did with Peggy was, Peggy said, I went to my doctor and he said, Peggy, I have some bad news for you. You've got pancreatic cancer. And she said, well, what do I do? And he said, well, Peggy, you're going to die. And she said, I didn't know that, that there was a cure for pancreatic cancer. And then I went to CTCA and, I am now cancer free or in remission. And that was an enormously powerful ad. It was shortly after she had gone into remission that they made that ad. Again, are you evaluating the quality of the care based on objective factors? For example, the Mayo Clinic's success rate versus CTCA success rate, the quality of the doctors that go to work for the Mayo Clinic versus the quality of the doctors that work for CTCA, right? And how do you evaluate that? One of the things that I ask students is, for example, with regard to my own profession, how would you evaluate a lawyer? How do you think you should evaluate a lawyer?
Percentage of cases that they win.
Okay, that's what students always come up with, the percentage of cases that the lawyer wins. So I will tell you that some of the dumbest people in my law school class have nearly perfect success rate at winning cases. Why is that? And why do I say they're some of the dumbest people in my law school class? When I graduated from law school, I was paying $925 accredited hour for law school. If you went into the district attorney's office at the time that I graduated, if you got a job in the DA's office, you started out at something like $40,000 a year, right? So let's just do the math. Law school is 90 hours, 925 times 90, and of course there's fees. So that's $83,250 just in your law school tuition. That doesn't include fees. When you add books on that, at the time that I graduated, I was fortunate. I didn't have to take out a lot of loans. My family was able to pay for a lot of it. I had some, I took out some small loans, but I was living at home for free, so I didn't have to take that out. Most of the people that I went to law school with took out far more because you've got $83,000 in tuition expenses, then you've got fees, then you've got books, and you're gonna have to live, right, during this time period. So most people rented a house, and that required that they take out, sort of loans for living expenses. Those are unsecured, non-subsidized loans, generally made by private lenders that the government doesn't guarantee. They're not guaranteed loans. So you could get guaranteed loans for your tuition part of it. You couldn't get guaranteed loans for, all of the other stuff. So the average person at the time that I graduated from law school was coming out of law school with something like $150,000 to $200,000 in debt. On a 30-year note, so let's see if I can find my loan calculator. Even at very low interest, loan calculator. So $200,000 or $250,000 on a 30-year note at, say, 4%. That's $1,193 a month in payment. And if you're making $40,000 a year, so just figure that out, $40,000 a year divided by 12, that's $3,333 before taxes. Figure that you're going to take home about 70% of that. That's $2,333. So half of your income is walking out the door to service the debt on your student loans, right? If you couldn't figure this out, like, in my opinion, you're a candidate for natural deselection, right? But they have fantastic win-loss ratios because criminals are stupider than they are, right? I mean, they get caught. And usually the evidence is sort of overwhelming against the people that are caught. I used to practice, law in Guthrie, and you were appointed. At one time, if you were a member of the County Bar Association, you got appointed to represent defendants on a random basis. One of the defendants I talked to, and I said, "Did you confess? Have you signed a confession?" And he said, "No, absolutely not. I did not confess. I didn't say anything." Right. So we're at the preliminary hearing. He's going to be bound over for trial. I suggested that the case against him was fairly weak. They didn't have much physical evidence. There wasn't, cameras of the crime that he'd committed. And I said, I think we should release him on his own recognizance. And the district attorney says, "Well, Your Honor, we have a confession. So we think he should be bound over and stay in jail pending trial." And I said, "What?" And he's like, so he hands me this piece of paper, and at the top of the piece of paper, it says statement. And the statement was underneath it, "I did it, signed my client." And I said, "I thought you didn't confess." There's a statement. because it didn't say confession at the top of the paper, he thought that he hadn't confessed. When you know, when that's the quality or caliber of intellect that you're dealing with, it's no wonder that they have this wonderful win-loss ratio. I mean, they win, 95% or more of their cases. In some places, it's even higher, because if they don't have a fairly strong case, they don't file it. They don't bring it to trial, because they know that in the next election, which is every 4 years, district attorneys are up for election. They know that in the next election, their opponent is going to focus on the fact that they don't have a very good win-loss ratio, right? So if you were looking at some other things, that might be, if you were looking at other areas of the law, that might be a good indicator. But there's no guarantee of success in the law, right? Prior to the most recent Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade, if you were a constitutional lawyer and you were arguing on the side of reproductive health services that had, filed lawsuits against states that were imposing ever greater restrictions on abortion access, you probably would have thought that you had a pretty good shot at winning that case in the Supreme Court. And even the law that was challenged, the Mississippi law in that case, nobody thought the court would go as far as it did. They thought the case said that you could start restricting in Mississippi the right to have an abortion after 13 weeks. Well, that's sort of within the Roe framework. The Roe framework came up with trimester approaches to abortion and said, in the first trimester, which is the first 3 months, you have an unrestricted right to have an abortion. In the second trimester, the state could start to place restrictions on abortion, but they couldn't unduly burden that right. And then in the third trimester, you could have more and more restrictions, right? But it had to provide sort of a safety valve, which was the life or health of the mother. You would think that what Mississippi was asking was after the second trimester, and Roe had been modified by a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which focused on viability. And viability is becoming ever more earlier in terms of pregnancy. They're now, what you couldn't have saved 20 years ago in terms of a premature baby is becoming far, far greater. So you would have looked at, a lawyer who took that case and said, if you're betting on it, perhaps the court would have said, we're sustaining Roe and Casey, but we're going to allow the Mississippi, which is the position that John Roberts actually took in that case, which was, I would sustain this case because 13 weeks is by definition after the first trimester, right? If you take a month to be a 4-week period, the first trimester is 12 weeks, you're now into sort of the second trimester. So how do you go about evaluating these things like legal services when you see, the ads for Dan Davis, for example, on the helpline? How do you go about evaluating the quality of that attorney? Well, it can be really, really difficult. And I think you have to rely on sort of credence properties to make that evaluation. Again, this can be really, really difficult for even really intelligent people. So when I was in practice as a corporate attorney, one of my colleagues came to me and he said, Grant, I'm getting a divorce and I need you to recommend a divorce attorney for me. He knew that I couldn't take the case because I was, an officer in the corporation that he worked in. That would have been a clear conflict of interest. And he said, so I would like for you to recommend a divorce attorney. And I gave him 2 names. I said, what kind of divorce are you looking at? Is this going to be contentious? Is it not going to be contentious? And he said, I don't think it's going to be terribly contentious. We're pretty amicable in this. And I recommended somebody, and he got on Angie's list And this would seem to be, at least somebody who's thinking about how to evaluate. The attorney said, came back to me and he said, can you give me the name of somebody else? Because she's got horrible reviews on Angie's List. And I said, well, what are the reviews? And so I got on Angie's List and he showed me the reviews and they were all like, half my stuff left and it's all her fault. That's where you're gonna end up in Oklahoma, right? Oklahoma is not it is not technically a no-fault divorce state, and we're not technically a community property state, but we function like both of those things when it comes to the practical application of divorce law. So in Oklahoma, you can file for divorce under irreconcilable differences. And the theory at Oklahoma law is that that's dual fault. You're both at fault. There is no, in a no-fault divorce state, you just say, nobody's at fault. It's just what happens. In Oklahoma, technically, you're both at fault. And we find you, grant the divorce on the grounds that you're both at fault. And then we're not a community property state, but we function like one, which is that if you don't have a prenuptial agreement, half your stuff is probably going to walk. It's an equitable distribution of your things is going to walk out the door. So I'm looking at these reviews and I said, well, Paul, this is really not fair to this attorney. And he's like, yeah, but I mean, these people, they've gone through it. So I'm going to take, and I'm like, these people are not qualified to make decisions about the quality of a lawyer. I am qualified to make decisions about the quality of a lawyer based on having been a lawyer, right? So when we advertise for these things, sometimes it's really, really hard to use rational appeals in these cases. One of the things that I think about, so here in the local Oklahoma City area, there's an attorney who advertises on television. It's Parrish and Devon, it's two attorneys. And their slogan is Pepper Wins. That's the first name of one of these attorneys. I can't remember which one is Pepper, if it's Pepper Parrish or Pepper Devon, I can't remember. But, it's Pepper Wins. Well, if you look at his win-loss ratio, he settles a lot of cases, so that's technically a win, right? He's won. But one of my friends insists that he leaves, about $500,000 to $1 million on the table in every settlement that he takes. He pressures his clients, according to this other attorney. I don't know if this is true, but I'm going to take. He practices in that area to accept settlements that are far lower than what they could get if they would push the defendant closer and closer to trial. And the closer you get, this is just sort of a fact of life in the litigation world. The closer you get to the courthouse steps, generally speaking, the larger the settlement will go. And defense attorneys have an incentive to wait to that point. They are hired to, save their clients as much money as they can, but they also know, defense attorneys know, that if they ever take something to trial and they lose, their career as a defense attorney is over. So they have an incentive to settle, but they don't want to settle until, until generally the last minute. And so it can be really, really hard in a lot of these situations with a lot of services and goods, particularly when we think about another area, pharmaceutical sales. We're one of only two countries that allows direct consumer advertising of pharmaceutical products. How do you tell whether or not a product is a good drug, right? There are all of these ads that come out after drugs are released. If you used X product and experienced, irritable bowel syndrome as a result, contact the law firm of X, Y, and Z, because you may be entitled to a settlement without having to go to court. And a lot of them, one of these law firms, their number is like 1-800-BAD-DRUG. That's their telephone number. How do you evaluate that? Are you really in a position to evaluate whether or not these drugs are effective? You have to rely largely on, the FDA says that they're effective and that they're not, harmful. The additional types of appeals, two other types of appeals that we have. The reminder. Why is it that McDonald's advertises? Everybody knows what McDonald's is. If you've been in America for more than 5 seconds, and if you've been in any developed nation at any time, and even some underdeveloped nations, you probably have seen a McDonald's, unless you're, in the jungles of the Amazon and have not had much contact with, the rest of the world. You're probably going to know what McDonald's is. Why does McDonald's advertise, even though they have this huge market share? Well, to remind people, right, of what it is you like about McDonald's. Now, what they portray and what it is that most of us like about McDonald's may not have a great match. For most of us, what we appreciate about McDonald's is it's cheap, although that's debatable now as prices have gone up. It's cheap, it's fast, and it's consistent, right? I mean, you know what you're going to get when you go to McDonald's. When you order the quarter pounder with cheese, it's going to taste like the quarter pounder with cheese that you had, no matter whether you're in New York City or Oklahoma City. The other is a teaser type ad. This is usually for the launch of new products. So to get interest in the product, they'll release teaser ads. One of the ones that I remember them releasing an ad in Billboard in Oklahoma City it said, "It's coming," and then several months later, they said, it'll be here soon. And then, 30 days, and I don't even remember what the product was now, but that's a teaser ad to build or generate interest in the release of a new product. The execution of ads. Now, a lot of these the execution depends on whether or not you're using a fear or an emotional based ad, or whether or not you're using a rational based ad, right? So straightforward, factual, that's obviously going to be for the rational ads, just focusing on the facts of what the product does. What is this particularly good for? Well, it's good for utilitarian type things. Focus on the benefits that this will provide. If you're looking for a lawnmower and they have advertisements this time of year for lawnmowers because we're coming into spring and everybody's got to mow their yard, focusing on, the factual. This is the easiest, fastest, quickest, the tightest turning radius of the zero turn mower, things like that. Scientific or technical data, things like pharmaceutical ads focus on the scientific. In clinical trials, 98% of men regrew hair by using Propecia, something like that. The demo, showing the actual use of the product. Again, this is a scientific, technical, and demo and comparison are all usually used with rational based ads. So comparison, you see this a lot, same ingredients as, or compared to. The testimonial ad, this is one that can go either way. In a testimonial, you see a lot of, it was very popular several years ago, and they've become less popular. I've seen fewer ads for them, but they used to have things like the psychic network. I don't think that, psychics are terribly scientific or even legitimate, but they would have testimonies from people who claim that, she predicted all of my life's, goals would come true. It's, Ms. Cleo was one of them that they had on the psychic network, and they use testimonials. You can also have testimonials in, the more rational based ads. I took, Propecia and I regrew my hair. A slice of life ad, focusing on, like a little vignette, showing some kind of aspect of life that this product or service will fit into. Animation are oftentimes used with ads targeted towards children. Using a personality to endorse the product. This one is largely effective if there is some congruence between what the person is endorsing and the product or service that they are trying to sell. So for example, Buick several years ago decided to come up with an ad that used Tiger Woods to try and convince younger people that a Buick was not your grandmother's car. I'm not sure how effective that ad was. Shortly after they started running those ads, Tiger began to have some problems in his personal life, and he, was getting a sort of a nasty divorce. His wife took after him, I think, with a golf club or something because he was cheating on her. That didn't end terribly well. But even in spite of that, what does Tiger Woods know about? He knows about golf. So if you're selling the new, Ping Zing driver or something like that, I think you have a lot more credibility than you do selling an automobile. Whereas, maybe if you used, I don't know, who's a big race car driver now to sell the Buick, that might have Danica Patrick, for example. That might have a better impact. Using imagery, drama, obviously, these are for more emotional based ads, and humor. Humor, again, can be effective in getting people's attention, but there is some evidence to suggest that humor is less effective as a motivator to get people to actually buy. But you see humor used a lot. A lot of the Cheetos ads, if you think about the Cheetos leopard that, is kind of this cool animated character, uses a lot of humor in those kinds of appeals. So how do we evaluate this? After we've come up with our integrated marketing communication plan, how do we evaluate it? Is the plan consistent with the brand's objectives? So you have to know what the brand's objectives are. What is Disney's objective? So today they announced Disney is going to lay off 7,000 people across all of their various enterprises. So they've got Disney Parks, and then they've got Disney Entertainment, things like that. What is the brand's objectives? Well, Disney's brand's objectives depend on whether we're talking about, their movie and entertainment division, or whether we're talking about their theme parks. But they generally try to present a consistent whole, and across all of those brands segments, across all of their sort of different entertainment and amusement venues, they try to present sort of this consistent image of what the brand is. So what are Disney's objectives? Well, it's obviously to get people to watch their movies, go to their movies, go to the theme parks, and buy their merchandise, right? So is it consistent with their objectives when they release these ads? For example, they came out with an ad, Experience the Magic, several years ago. Well, that's pretty consistent with their objectives. Disney wants to create an experience that is focused on what they started out as years and years ago when they built, Disneyland, when Walt Disney developed the first theme park in Anaheim, California, which was, this is the happiest place on earth. And they've stuck to that for a very long time. And having been a Disney fan and gone to Disney World and Disneyland a lot, I can tell you that they are pretty successful in the most artificial of places, something that is completely made up. You have this feeling that it is actually real, right? You have this feeling of reality, and it is absolutely, an incredible experience. Is it consistent with the creative strategy? Is the IMC consistent with the creative direction? Is it appropriate for the target audience? So understanding what we are trying to, or who we are trying to sell to. At the beginning of the 20th century, what we saw broadly was the mass production of homogeneous goods. The idea that really people all sort of wanted the same thing. And we could just produce goods in mass quantities and people would buy them. And because what came before was so sort of limited, that was largely true. If we think about, if we go back to the first automobile, the first mass-produced automobile, Henry Ford's Model T, you could have it in any color you wanted so long as that color was black. That's a horrible color, right? I think cars should all be one color, but it shouldn't be black. Particularly in Oklahoma, they should all be white because that does the most amount to reflect the heat of the sun that we have for well over 6 months out of the year here, this sort of intense sun. But you know, most people, they don't want necessarily just white or black cars. Most people want, you know, sort of something that's indicative of their personality, you know, candy apple red or something, you know, else. My niece bought a Ford Mustang and the color was called Grabber Blue. I don't even know what Grabber Blue is. I mean, I know what color it is, but it's sort of this, you know, enormously intense, bright, not baby blue, but you know, this really blue color. So we went from at the beginning of the 20th century to this idea that people are really all the same or largely the same, and we could sort of, you know, mass produce stuff in small, medium, and large sizes, to now we're no longer just selling products. Everything is completely differentiated. Even the most commoditized goods are highly differentiated. Chevron, for example, if you think about fuel, fuel is fuel. I think it's Chevron that has Tectron, which is supposed to be a cleaning agent that they add to their a fuel additive, which is supposed to, you know, burn cleaner in your engine and create less wear and tear, less oil usage, things like that. We even see, even in those areas where people are pretty much sold on price. That's, you just sort of look around at, you know, where's the cheapest gas and that's where I'm going to buy it, rather than being sort of brand loyal. We're even seeing differentiation in that. Milk, when I was growing up as a kid, there were basically two types of milk. There was skim milk and whole milk. That was it. Now you've got, you know, chocolate milk that's already pre-made. You've got 2% milk and 1% milk. Even though there's not very much difference in terms of the calorie count between 1 and 2 and whole milk, people think that there is. People have this idea that fat is what makes you fat. That's not what makes you fat. It's just calories, right? I mean, it doesn't matter whether the calories come from fat or whether they come from something else. But we have these completely differentiated products in almost every single thing. So if we're going to differentiate the products, we're obviously looking for target audiences. We're trying to come up with who is it that is the likely person to buy this. Is the message clear and convincing? And this is, again, a not trivial point. As I pointed out when we talked about ethics, what is it we can know and how can we know it? Well, you know, I did this thing about what is this? Is this a table or is it a desk? How do we tell that it's a table and not a desk? Everybody says, you know, like they always say, well, this is a table. Why is it a table? Well, it doesn't have drawers. So all tables or all desks have drawers? I don't know, right? Lots of the desks that we have now that are stand-up desks, they don't have drawers, right? And so how do we know this? How are we sure that we're developing a clear and convincing message? It's not trivial, but evaluating that, you know, using focus groups to tell us what they find or what they are not clear about. Does the ad overwhelm the message? Are you overwhelmed? Are you getting lost in the message that you're trying to convey? This is particularly true with highly creative ads. You can get so caught up, think about the ad that I showed you for herding cats. You can get so caught up in sort of the juxtaposition of the storyline from what you expect that it's highly creative, but it sort of overwhelmed the message, which the ultimate message at the end of that ad is, this is sort of what we do, you know, bringing people and things together, EDS. It was completely lost in that ad. Is it appropriate for the media environment in which it's seen? So we'll talk about the different types of media and how we approach those, what the advantages and disadvantages are. Next time we'll start on that. Is it truthful and tasteful? This part particularly can change. Again, if you went back in time to, let's say, the 1950s or 60s, there were all kinds of sports teams that were named after Native American iconography. The Chiefs, the Braves, right? In our contemporary era, those oftentimes seem to be less than sensitive to a group of people that have historically been discriminated against. Not just discriminated against, but you know, we actively attempted to eradicate, in many instances, these groups. The Redskins said that they were never going to change their symbol because they had so much invested in that brand. Most of those brands are now changing. When Oklahoma City University first started their sports teams, they were the Oklahoma City Chiefs, and they had this sort of very stereotypical Native American chief in full headdress as their symbol. They've changed. They're now the Oklahoma City Stars because they have the gold star building. So these things can change, based on new standards or emerging standards. Also, what seems to be truthful at one moment, particularly with regarding the advertising of pharmaceutical products, can change. Just because something goes through clinical trials doesn't necessarily mean that it's all that effective. And how do we ensure that we're communicating that in a truthful way? Do most people, are they qualified to evaluate? You know, when they say in clinical trials, 95% of men regrew hair with Propecia. Well, how much hair did they grow? And what are the side effects and things like that of that? So truthful. What is statistically significant, for example? I mean, if you get a large enough sample size, you find statistical significance. One of the things that a lot of people argue is, like, we had this data set of 10,000 participants. Well, with 10,000 participants, almost everything turns out to be statistically significant. So is it truthful? Is it tasteful? How do we evaluate that? And can that change? That's it for today. So if you feel cheated, just let me know and we'll stay late next Tuesday. In the stream, and then